Coming up on a great episode of Locked On Nets podcast, keeping an eye on the NBA playoffs. While the Brooklyn Nets are out, certain teams like Boston and Philadelphia give us threads to pull on for where Nets fans should be looking for optimism, hope, a buoy to a bad run from Brooklyn. And then on top of which, another player shows up on the injury report, surgery. We assume that Seth Curry will be ready for training camp and good to go. How does this all impact what the Nets accomplish this offseason? It's all coming up right after the theme music.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Oh, that's right. It's the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. Over there, you're going to find Doug Norrie, owner-operator DFSR, for all your daily fantasy sports rankings. DraftKings, FanDuel, he's got you covered. Blue Check Certified, fresh on Twitter. Over here, you're going to find me, Adam Armbrecht, breaking down the New York Football Giants on the One Giant podcast all off-season with my boy, Andy Mack. Thank you for making us your first listen of the day. We're free on all those great platforms. And Doug, do we have a humdinger of an episode here as we start by lamenting what could have been watching the Boston Celtics and the Philadelphia 76ers continue to battle their way through the Eastern Conference playoffs.
Yeah, these playoffs are a weird, sort of testing grounds for your fandom because it's, well, one, if you're just only a fan of the Nets, then you don't really care because you're not a fan of the NBA, you move on with your life and just go, watch Yankees baseball or get into the WNBA or whatever.
Ozark,
not like these aren't mutually exclusive. These aren't mutually exclusive. You're allowed to do all of them, by the way. But but it is interesting the storylines that kind of have developed around where the Nets are. What the teams remaining and how the Nets are related to them, because obviously, you would say, okay, we lost to the champs. If Boston were to win, you can't really look at it and say, oh, if only, because they got dumpstered so hard by Boston. So it's not like the Bucks last year. It's like, oh, we were a foot away from winning the championship because we almost beat Milwaukee. Not quite the same situation this season. So I don't think we have, you can't really go in with that, back clapping a little bit. And then you get, the Harden thing, which I actually think has some people, just kind of confused, because I've seen people take the stance of, oh, we should be rooting for Harden because he's next net and whatever. I found that confusing, but I think there is a contingent of people, maybe they're just Harden stans that are out there that are doing it. I actually think it's probably more the other way, where you just want to see them lose pretty hard and then he re-signs with another team or something like that. But I do think there's enough threads for the Nets fans to pull on in these playoffs if you're interested in it, because where do you land? Because where do you have a rooting interest here? I think I do, but I'm curious where you are.
Well, let's start with Boston, because I think, to your point, it's not like you went to game 7 and it was so close, and then if they go on to be the eventual champs, it's also different too. Like, I always associate it in any sport, if you're in the Eastern Conference Finals and you lose, then you want to see that team go on. If you're, one step away, if you're watching the Giants and they lose in even the second round of the playoffs, it makes a difference. When you get knocked out in the first round, it just feels like it's kind of impossible to project any level of confidence around what could have happened going forward in that. But even still, I guess if you want to take solace from that series, it would be the Boston Celtics so handily took care of Brooklyn that it wouldn't have mattered had it gone 7. Like, Boston was going to win that series. The Nets were not ready to win playoff games. That's what I took away from getting swept out by Boston. So in that regard, Boston has only gone on to look, continue to look strong. I have serious questions around what Al Horford did in his time to let's cross over. What was he up to in Philadelphia versus what he's now doing in Boston? Good Lord, is there something very specific in the Boston water that this guy's like, oh, that's what elite basketball looks like? Because that's a version of him that I never anticipated being in the Nets series, and I don't think anybody anticipated going forward. So that one on itself, I just look at it and go, man, this is just more proof that the Nets were not in playoff-ready basketball.
Yeah, for sure. Like, he's had an unbelievable series. Obviously, he just completely turned the clock back last game with the 30 points, but he's been excellent. Obviously, double every game before that.
Yeah.
In the Bucks series, he's been amazing. They got him specifically, I think, to be able to deal with Giannis. That has worked out for the most part pretty well. I think I am just straight up rooting for Boston at this point. Not rooting for them with any kind of fiery passion, but I do think the way that team is put together, I really enjoy, at least from the East. I love Giannis too. This one's hard. I definitely don't want the Sixers to win. Like, that one's very easy. I don't
Oh
think.
yeah, we can get to that in a second here. That one's a
I mean, that one
one to
seems.
one.
Well, it's weird though, because I kind of do love Embiid, but the Harden thing is just a bridge too far on the exit. So Harden overshadows my feelings about Embiid in this one, because I just can't watch him go any further. It's too annoying the way that ended. So
Well,
I think if I was just gonna hierarchy this, I know you're itching to say something about Harden here, but like if I was to hierarchy it, I think I would probably say Boston, Milwaukee, Miami, who I also kind of can't stand, and then Philly. But it's clearly, for me, the top tier is whoever wins that Boston Milwaukee series. I kind of want to go on. I just think they have the best chance to win the championship too. So I think it's just for the best basketball. But I think that's where I'm landing right now, and I'm just really kind of appreciative of what the Celtics have done, because it has not been the most formulaic way to sort of go about creating what's probably considered to be a championship contender. And they just definitely are, because they're like, oh yeah, everyone wants the offense, let's just go defense, dude. And it's just an interesting way to do it. So I think that's kind of where I land with these four teams, at least in the East.
Yeah, I mean, going against convention of how you construct a championship roster here. They obviously have incredibly talented players. When we talk about Tatum and Jaylen Brown is starting to come on more in this series. So yeah, they're an easy team to root for. I don't know if Nets fans look at it and go, well, they beat us, so I don't want to see them go on any further.
Well, there's no reason to root against them. Like, they don't have any villains on this team. Like, you want to go and say you hate Harden, whatever. You can dislike Embiid too. I think there's plenty of people that do. Maybe you don't like Jimmy Butler, and that's a reason. You don't like Lowry. I think there's guys that are easy to watch and not really kind of totally take to. I don't feel like Boston has those guys on the team. Like Tatum. Like, if you were just translate yourself into it, like, it's easy to make cases for them.
Yeah, I was almost going to put Miami like above Milwaukee, because I think Miami's a really well-coached team. They're a very well-run organization. But to your point, there's no one inherently like on Milwaukee, Giannis and the big players for Milwaukee. You don't look at them and go, oh God, I'd hate to see Giannis continue to have success. Like, those are easy players to root for first. And then the way that their teams play also makes it for an exciting team to get behind. Whereas there are villains, so to speak, right? There are villains on Philadelphia or Miami where you don't necessarily want to wrap your head around. So from that standpoint, yeah, listen, the James Harden piece, I will just say this, I don't get at all. Like, this is not D'Angelo Russell circa, 4 or 5 years ago, when you say, well, you had kind of this darling run, made a little bit of playoffs, and you then see him go on to somewhere else like Minnesota ultimately, and you say, hey, he's a former Net. We wish him nothing but success. The reason why you wish him nothing but success is because your team wasn't good when you had him, and it wasn't terribly sad to see him go. Whereas now, like, I don't know why anybody, like, I was excited when the Nets got James Harden because he made the big three and it made him a very competitive team. We thought championship. As soon as he was gone, though, I mean, that's about as short a term rental of a player that you could possibly have in a franchise, let alone the fact that he, judge it however you want, seemed to have made it very clear that his exit strategy was, I don't want to be here. You have to get rid of me and send me where I want to go. We saw a bit of it when we were doing this podcast when Harden was on here. Fair weather fans, player fans that followed Harden here to Brooklyn and then followed him right to Philly. So I think those are the ones that drive that kind of narrative.
That is the only group of Harden lovers left. Like, the Harden stands, and it was funny because Jackson Gatlin from Locked On Rockets was the first one, not the first one, but he was on it. He was like, enjoy it because these guys and gals are relentless, and he wasn't wrong. And then he wanted to be the first one to do a post op on that trade because he kind of saw it coming. The Harden thing, if you're a Harden just kind of lover because you've loved him your whole life, and I've always been actually a defender of at least stylistically of his basketball. Even when many people just said they didn't like it and whatever, I've always defended that. But at this point, with the way that it was exited, I just don't think you just can't root for it. It's just kind of bad for basketball. This kind of thing where it's you're under contract and you just force your way out and you clearly just tank it, and you tank it in multiple situations. I just don't know how anyone's a fan of that. I don't know how you can look at that and be a fan of it. It's like, and not like I have not like I think any of this is like all this crazy huge stakes in the grand scheme of the real world. It's all a zero. I get it. But if you want to put it in the confines of basketball, I just don't know what the defense is. Like just be bad and go play on a new team, and then you be bad again and go play on another team. I like, what is fun about that? It's the least fun. It's the least fun thing in all sports. I will say, outside of injuries, which can't be helped, that kind of thing is the least fun thing in sports. I don't know. It's just totally indefensible.
Well, and this was the old, and I want to ask you, I'm going to look over at the Western Conference and ask a bigger question about Harden here in a second, but this is like, what's worse than being, intentionally tanking team, right? Bottom dwelling, trust the process, like Philadelphia for all of those years there. So just understand, we're going to play 82 games and we don't give a crap. I always thought that was like the lowest possible version, right, of being a professional team on any level and going, yeah, F it, for not just this year, for several years, but it's going to round itself into form at some point. You can justify it if it gets you a cornerstone player like a Joel Embiid. But this is the worst thing. The worst thing is openly being a player in the NBA who goes, I don't want it, and I'm going to do what's necessary to leave. And then when it gets capitulated to, because you kind of feel like you have to, now the precedent has been set. If you're disgruntled, we've already seen this as far as some players communicating, hey, I'm not going to come back on another contract. You're going to want to move me. But guys that outright midway through a season decide this isn't it for me, especially at a certain level of talent, it's a dangerous precedent to you. Like, to your point, I think it starts to water down the value of rooting for teams, obviously, which has already gone out the window a bit. But now you really water it down to say, I don't know, man. You could have 3-4 different players on a roster, key players on a roster from one season to the next. The trade deadline, the buyout market has that kind of impact as well already. And the Nets benefited from that in some regards. But there's this very fluid nature of rosters where players kind of come out of nowhere to be borderline significant, to championship runs to different levels. And Harden falls into that category too for me.
Yeah, you can't have watched the Kings game, his like basically one of his final, or maybe was his final game. You can't watch that Kings game and root for Harden after that. Like, there's no possible way. It was one of the all-time tank jobs for a team that wasn't in the tank, right? Like that a team at the time.
That's what I mean. Right. Not a bad team going spiraling. This is a team that was trying to win a championship. It's still at that point. And you were like,
at least with the Rockets thing, it was like, okay, the team stinks. We're probably headed in the wrong direction. We're not going to get into the luxury tax. There's a lot of other reasons to kind of not like the situation. I don't actually think even at the time, many people, maybe not everyone loved the Harden process, but I don't think anyone really blamed him. I think that it was kind of obvious. This was just so egregious. So anyway, all this is to say, we're rooting against the Sixers dead last year. And we're recording this as they're playing here, and they're getting dumpstered by the Heat. So we'll see.
Boom. That's the kind of vibes we want to put out there in the world. I want to ask you a question about a key player that I know you're a lifelong fan of before we go big picture a little bit here, specifically on the Brooklyn Nets, and also talk about another key injury for them. But first, got to tell you about our friends over at AG1 from Athletic Greens. Why? That's because, as I told you before, I literally, and I mean that term literally, use this product every single day because it goes ahead and gives me the key health that I need when it comes to my gut. I have a gluten allergy. It means that my body has difficulty processing the nutritional value that it needs from all those great food sources. I can't always get up in the morning and prepare the perfect meal and balance my diet on a day-to-day basis. With one scoop from AG1, mix it up, stir that up, drink it down, and I know that I'm going to go ahead and get myself 75 high-quality vitamins, minerals, whole food source superfoods, probiotics, and adaptogens to help me start my day off right. It's a special blend of ingredients that supports my gut health, also going to give you nervous system support, my immune system, energy, little boost there, recovery, focus, drive, and battle that little dirty devil we talk about, aging. When you go over, because Athletic Greens wants to make it easy for you, they're going to go ahead and give you a free 1-year supply of immune-supporting vitamin D and 5 free travel packs with your first purchase. All you have to do is visit athleticgreens.com/NBA network. Again, that's athleticgreens.com/NBA network to take ownership over your health and pick up the ultimate daily nutritional insurance. So before I want to get back to James Harden here and the big picture question, I think, from the Nets perspective. But one last note on the NBA playoffs. I know that you absolutely love Chris Paul, that he is arguably your favorite player. When
he's not, well, that's overstating it. I don't think he's my favorite player, but
he's absolutely, hands down, poster on your wall, dreaming of the day, your favorite player. That we understand.
Okay, well, I'm going to clarify this, somewhat of an overstatement here, but after you're finished with your question, but go ahead.
I know that you like Chris Paul as a player. Yeah. I think that's fair to say. But when you look over at the Western Conference, from a player that's been around a long time and is obviously deserving, we think, of winning an NBA title, does it feel like this guy can't catch the break? Because now all of a sudden Dallas and they're getting Luka back, and that series is very much hanging in the balance. We know they're dealing with injuries on Phoenix side. It's more just that example of like how temperamental NBA playoffs and championship runs can be, because one key player goes down in support of Chris Paul, and suddenly it just flips the script a little bit. And you can go from a 2-year, maybe 3-year run here where you could have been the odds-on favorites. You're right in the hunt where things broke right in the Western Conference with some other high-power teams, and yet you could fall by the wayside.
Yeah, look, he's not my favorite player of all time. I don't really
Number
have a
one.
favorite player, so I'm just going to say that. I do think he's like been criminally underrated. That's probably shifted a little bit over the last couple years just because he's had this late career resurgence that's been so good. I personally was one of the biggest fans of when the Rockets brought him in at the time, because even though it was so weird and I know that it was not a appreciated move at the time, and that was one of my first. I liked it at the time, even though I thought it was weird. And everyone was like, oh, you got 2 ball handlers. Obviously proved that was totally the correct move. But that was actually one of my first inklings that just getting the best players and figuring it out later was the move. There's been many other examples over the years, but that was the first time where I really tuned into it and said, yeah, guys like Chris Paul and James Harden can just figure it out. It's actually why when I wanted to trade for Harden, I was like, they'll just figure it out. He's played with other superstars before. It's been temperamental, but the Chris Paul thing, even though he ran Paul out on the rails, which ended up being the wrong thing to do. I think with Paul, now look, I think from a skill wise kind of idea that it's kind of unmatched, and his attention and acuity to the game is basically unmatched. At times, he's not the easiest guy to root for. That last game was a good example of this, where he fouled out. I mean, the fouls were mostly garbage. He didn't really argue with them. They were all technically by the books fouls, but they were all Chris Paul-y kind of things to do, and he just got called for every single one of them and fouled out. He can be sort of impossible along those lines to watch. I think that's why I wouldn't say he's my favorite player, because while I appreciate the greatness, I don't always find it to be the most fun thing in the world to watch either. It's the non-basketball stuff. I could go through a whole list of the non-basketball stuff, and this is like kind of why I don't always root for these guys. I find Luka like this too. I love every single thing he does basketball wise, and I hate every single thing he does non-basketball. Right? Like anything that's non-basketball related, I find completely impossible. Kyle Lowry's like this. Chris Paul is like this. Like there's lots of players that are like this, where it's like, hey, I love when you have the ball in your hands or on the court, it's great. When it's the arguing and the flopping and this, and just like hunting weird fouls that you'd get kicked out of the Y for playing pickup and doing, like no one would invite you back. Like that stuff, I just absolutely can't stand. To the Nets' credit, Kyrie and Katie don't play like this, so it's actually more fun. It doesn't do them any favors, but because they don't kind of play by the rules. Anyway, this is a long-winded response to say, I am probably past the part where I'm like dying to see Chris Paul win a title, because I think the chances have been there. And at this point, if it happens, it happens. It doesn't, it doesn't. I did feel this way like for a couple other years, specifically the Rockets year, when I had a huge bet on them making the finals, and they missed every single free throw. Everything was a little tie there.
There's a reason why. There's a reason why he was actually rooting. I confused that part. Big fan of Chris Paul. Also big fan of Chris Paul helping me win money. That's always a part that comes in.
So anyway, long story short is to say, I am rooting for really good basketball in those series. There's been times where those series have not turned into very good basketball, and they've been kind of brutal to watch.
Yeah.
So that's kind of where I land with Chris Paul. I think I gave like sort of a meandering answer on that, but it's at least how I'm viewing the Western Conference playoffs right now.
It's interesting to think about that, though, because again, inevitably, the extra things, as you said, the non-basketball pieces do play a role in how I view who I want to see have success in the NBA playoffs when I don't have a vesting interest.
I just gotta say one more thing about Luka. It's impossible. It's impossible.
He's a whiner.
It's every time. It's every time. It's going to talk to the refs. It looks kind of patronizing. It's like the face, the smirk, the argue. You get fouled every time. Everything's a bad call. It's like, enough. I guess if I was able to turn away from those moments, I probably wouldn't care, because what happens in the basketball court is pretty awesome. I do find that does ruin my enjoyment of the game at sometimes, where it's just everyone's complaining. He's not the only one for sure, but the just constant complaining, it's competitive fire. I get what it is, but it's just not fun to watch. And so that's where I think he's kind of public enemy number one for me on that one. There are other ones for sure. Most NBA players have a problem with this, but I do find he's just taking a book. He's taking a page right out of Chris Paul's book, now he's that guy. And I just find it to be, I just find it to be kind of impossible.
Yeah, there's a very different. I think there's the players are always engaged in conversation, but there's ways that guys do it in the process of still playing the game and having that conversation, or stepping to the side where it looks like you mentioned the one piece of it. I know we're getting far afield on this, but but I think it is pertinent because we talk about Kyrie Irving and all the non-basketball stuff that can influence how you feel about him. But you mentioned patronizing. Like those do feel like two-way streets, right? Like referees can be a little bit on the wrong side of the line with the way that they give fouls out or tee players up or have an edge around certain guys. I think players can also kind of stand there and give this impression of, hey, man, this is kind of not basketball related. I just think that you're less than me. And that's kind of the way that I'm going to talk to you about whether or not I should have been fouled or what I'm deserving.
And oftentimes they have like a legitimate gripe. So I get it. And it's hard. It's not like you can, when you're this level of competitor, it's going to be hard to toggle the switch of, now I'm not going to compete as hard when I try to argue for a foul. I understand this. Like this is part of what's being competitive. Like there are certain guys that, the fire that they bring, it's just, for those 48 minutes, they're not going to be able to turn it off. I just wish there was like sort of I really just more probably wish there was just a shift in just the overall NBA tone about this. I'm all for complaining about refereeing. I think the refereing's been super suspect in these playoffs too. Like it's been the ref show at times. I made a joke the other day. I was like, I can't wait to see which call they review next. Like I just like that's kind of what you're waiting for in these games because it can be totally impossible. Right. So I'm not saying that. It's more just trying to like frame how I see some of these guys playing and sort of who I'm rooting for.
I do want to get back over to the Harden commentary, but I will just say, in case you're making the Locked On Nets podcast your first listen, which we all know that you are, why don't you go ahead and make Locked On NBA Big Board your second listen? That's host Rafael Barlow from NBA Draft Junkies and author of the NBA Big Board newsletter. He's going to be breaking down the mock drafts, the player rankings, and of course, the big boards. It's free and available on those platforms. This is where you can find out who's the player that you don't want your team to draft because he may be a bit of a Luka.
Oh, if I got if the Nets could draft Luka right now, I'd like buy 4 season tickets and make sure my whole family had moved. I'd just move right next to Barclays if they had him. He'd be my favorite player to watch if he was on the Nets. Don't get me wrong.
My pet monster. That's my pet monster.
All right, but when you're done with that, make sure you go and grab a Built Bar as well. Summer is coming. You're going to need to have some food on the go. I know for me, this is always a challenge with the kids around. We're always showing up to something where I've not brought food and everyone else has brought food. Built Bar solves this problem. You throw them in the bag, you're good to go. You know you have a healthy option. You know they're going to taste great as well. These other protein bars that are out there, they didn't focus on the flavors. They didn't actually even focus on the texture. Built Bar focused on all of it, 100% covered in chocolate. The flavors are through the roof, almost 2 minute name. Basically, if you go like walk down the ice cream aisle and then just like plant those flavors into Built Bar, that is essentially what they give you. Banana cream pie, they get the cherry almond. All of it is good to go with Built Bar. Then the stats: 130 calories, 4 grams of sugar, 4 net carbs, 17 grams of protein. If you compare that to a candy bar doesn't even come close. Go to Built.com. Get all your favorites. Like I said, banana cream pie, raspberry, double chocolate, so many more, all delicious. New flavors are coming out all of the time. Go to Built.com. Use the promo code LOCK15 to get 15% off your order. Use promo code LOCK15 for 15% off at Built.com.
Okay, so I am going to ask the question around James Harden, but because there is this tie-in here, had the timelines worked out the same way, would you have wanted Brooklyn to throw assets to get Chris Paul? Like we talked about the other day about what do they lack? A pure point guard. What did they lose when James Harden left? The ball handler, the facilitator, the great term, the connector. Like what could Chris Paul have been the answer for Kyrie Irving and Kevin Durant as that next piece to a big three?
Oh, well, it just never would have happened because the Suns were, you mean this year? The Suns were competing.
No. I mean, like the timelines around when they got Harden, that difference of when he went from Houston, when he, made his way through the Thunder and everything else. Like I know if you could have spent assets on a aging veteran point guard, would Chris Paul have been the better suited player for what the Nets could have used?
I mean, I think they would all have been great. I mean, by the way, we're just going to clarify this. This is like these never would have happened. I think you're just looking for comparisons, right? Someone's going to say they couldn't have done that. And like, we totally get it. They couldn't have done this. Now I was a huge proponent of the Harden thing at the time for this very reason, like for this Chris Paul reason that I said before. I thought that you always just want to stack talent, like especially talent like that is like super cerebral around the basketball and like relatively unselfish, like if
Yeah.
or just generational scorers. Like what do they have? I think, and that's what by the way, this is kind of why I wanted Mike D'Antoni to be the coach, because like he had shown his ability to work with different personnel around James Harden,
Yeah.
and that was before they even had him. Anyway, I always think stacking talent like that, especially when it's super versatile on one or the other end of the court, is the best way to go. So Chris Paul fits that bill also. It's one of those, hey, we'll make it work here. I mean, he would obviously make everything work in sort of, it would be in a different fashion, but it would have totally worked. I'm always proponent to those guys. Like, this is the problem with some of this offseason stuff this year. And like the Nets problem they have now is like those guys are very few and far between. When you have the chance to get them, you should always. Now the Nets don't have, more options like this, and are going to kind of need to make it work with what they have. But I'm always a proponent of getting like the best players.
Yeah. and arguably the very small sample size with James Harden proved that to be correct.
Of course,
right?
It
suggested it would have worked. And
yes, it would have worked. It would have worked. Like, we know this. This isn't rocket science. I don't want to say the science is completely solved on this, but it's really close to solved. Like, if they had just stayed healthy, they would have won. I don't think that many people would push back on anything around that. I think it's kind of known. We want to just talk about Curry real quick before we get out of here. Like,
okay. Let's blow past the tease. The tease that remains a tease. We'll bring that up on another day. We talked just about this is labeled as Ben Simmons' impact here on the offseason, but we're framing it around injuries that have come out for obviously the Brooklyn Nets. Seth Curry, we talked about him and Joe Harris the other day. Now they're both guys that are going to be coming off of ankle surgery heading into the next season. What's the level of concern? It's another one gets labeled. They're going to have the press conference on Wednesday to end of the season. I'm sure they'll reference some of this stuff, but it's supposed to be ready for training camp. That's the good news, I suppose. The bad news is you now have a third key player potentially to this roster that's going to be coming back from an injury, and at least 2 out of the 3 are going to be over 30 years old when returning from it.
Yeah, I mean, are you worried? I mean, I'm glad that things get fixed. It was clearly hampering him at the end of the season, right? We knew the ankle was screwed up for him. He was playing through pain. It was just an injury management thing. You also, surgeries can make things better. They're never great signs. And so when you have 3 key players that are getting surgeries in the offseason, even if they're considered relatively minor, I mean, Harris is a redo, so that's not minor. But the Curry thing, it's not seeming like it's going to be some long-term problem. And usually when you get surgeries, you end up getting more surgeries. That's like the end. And the more players that you pile into a post-surgery timeline, it just lends more variance to what the outcomes are going to be. So glad he's getting healthy. Glad they're fixing whatever the problem was. I wouldn't say I feel super warm and fuzzy about it. Like, I thought it was really weird. Did you see a lot of people commented? I mean, maybe I just have a different thought process about this, but a lot of people commented in YouTube about how happy they were that Simmons got the surgery, and because like he was going to be better. And I was like, man, I'm glad when people can pinpoint problems, but surgery is just never going to make me feel better. Right. Like I'll never feel good about someone getting surgery, no matter what the reason, even if it's going to make them better than they were. It's still not great when anyone gets surgery. I thought that was a little odd. So anyway, I don't know. Are you worried about how worried are you about the Curry thing?
Well, I mean, I'll tell you maybe why here's why it doesn't matter if I'm worried, because now combining that, we had that discussion around Joe Harrison, around Seth Curry, and around Ben Simmons. To your point, surgery is never the good thing. Getting the surgery is never a great thing. It means, okay, what's the timeline? Will they be healthy? Will they be ready? We said, how is Seth Curry the guy with more trade value? Not right now. Like, now you're talking about going into an offseason and maybe trying to flex some money around. Now it even further entrenches it, I think, in that mindset of which we were talking about, one or the other. The best version might be keeping both of them. Guess what? The only version might be keeping the both of them, because they're 2 players with now an injury that they're coming off of. And at the very least, you got to get them healthy and show them on the court. Same thing with Ben Simmons. You got to be out there playing before you can even consider restructuring the team in a different way. I wasn't worried about Joe Harris, initially. And then I pretty quickly came around to saying, I don't think this guy is coming back as quickly as people say. Do we know for sure that Seth Curry surgery's done? He's good, ready for training camp? Or could we find out 2 months from now he needs a little bit more surgery, and now he's not ready for training camp? Now he's not ready for the start of the season. So yeah, I'm worried about all of it. There's no world that you could be 3 years into this process and version and iteration of the Brooklyn Nets, and when somebody gets hurt, not go, yeah, that's a concern. There's been 1,000 examples of this, and I might not even be exaggerating over this timeline. So yeah, now again, We're not even in the offseason yet, and we can already list 3 major question marks for Brooklyn.
And that also obviously hampers their value too. So, hey, listen, we're going to have over the next couple of days have a couple mailbag episodes. So if you have questions, definitely throw them over in YouTube in the comments, or send us a tweet at Locked On Nets, or either myself or Adam's Twitter at Doug Norrie or at Adam Armbrecht. Any of those places are good to throw a question. We're going to do probably a multi-part mailbag over the next couple of days, answering some more Nets off-season questions, because there are a ton. We've already got some in just from Twitter already. So make sure you get those in, like I said, over on YouTube. Like and subscribe. We're on YouTube as well.
Yeah, listen, there's no quote. Enjoy the playoffs, guys. We're gonna come back in mailbag stuff, I guess. I just, you know what? I didn't have it in me. You kind of got me bummed out here, so I'm gonna bail. I take a pass. I take a pass on the quote.
Adam Armbrecht, one of the all-time great poets. We'll be back again tomorrow talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.